Hi, folks. Welcome back to PLS 140, Module D, and that's going to be Chapters 7 and 8 with the themes of nationalism and religion and class and political economy, which is a mouthful. So we're going to see if we can tie some of it together, or at least go over one chapter at a time. So to start off with, some of the concepts in here you're going to hear me talk about, and I'll try my best to do a quick um, paraphrase of the definition. So, looking at first in chapter 7, the idea of national identity, uh, one comparison that's kind of intriguing is Canada and France, because Canada speaks some French, and France obviously speaks a lot more. Uh, and the thing is about Canada, they have about 40 million people, maybe not even that, and about half of them speak French, possibly not even that many, and but it is one of their two official languages. And France obviously is France. France speaks French. France celebrates French, both culture and language, but also cuisine and music and theater, history, tradition. France just celebrates all of those things. And don't get me wrong, Canada celebrates all of those things as well, but language, as we learn in sociology, is the carrier of culture. And Canada doesn't have its own original language. Canada alternates between English and French for the most part. Those are the two official languages that everyone in Parliament has to be able to speak, or at least read when they give speeches. They have to read the speech in both languages. Um, so Canada has what's called a multicultural citizenship, and that multicultural citizenship doesn't identify their their identities as citizens with their kind of homogenous culture, with their one language culture. Uh, France instead has what's called a universalist republicanism, where they acknowledge that the official language is French, but everyone kind of has equality within that. And whereas in France they have to sort of, I'm sorry, whereas in Canada they have to acknowledge and keep adherence to the idea of respect for other cultures and other languages, not yours, but others. France kind of has this universalism of its own culture. So they have one culture, or one language at least, and everyone within that culture who lives in France is a citizen of France and a citizen of the French Republic. And so they all have the same rights within it. And part of those rights, kind of the predicate to those rights, is that they have to be at least considering themselves French and identifying with kind of French republicanism. So what's problematic about that, of course, is that not everyone is a white French Christian who lives in France. And that certainly has been a difficulty of France in the last 10, 15, 20 years, when a large number of immigrants who have emigrated to France have been Muslim, either Algerian, one of France's former colonies, or from Syria, or from any number of other Middle Eastern countries that border France on the Mediterranean. So French republicanism sounds good if everyone does speak French and is from the soil of France, and so have their ancestors been. But if someone comes and speaks French but doesn't have a lot of other things in common with the French, presents a kind of difficulty to their liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, and brotherhood ideals that they've tried to embody, or at least give lip service to, since the revolution in 1789. So it resists this ethnic recognition in public policy. And so you do see dividing lines among even the fairly liberal president has taken somewhat of a harsh stance against some of the political violence that's happened, not only political violence, but really some of the terrorism that's occurred in France, um, and but also that has taken on somewhat of a um, some ethnic overtones and undertones. So Macron is considered mostly a liberal, maybe with the exception of how he has handled some of the violence that's occurred. But also, he is fending off a challenge, a long-term challenge from the right, from the National Front, this nationalist party that is much more explicitly anti-immigrant, but they have not as much pretense toward universalist republicanism, but they're more straightforwardly attempting to undermine some of that universalism. But so that's national identity. So looking at Canada and France is very different. Canada has mostly adhered to most of um, its liberal pretenses, uh, but they also have had a very difficult recognition with um, some of the Native Canadians treatment historically has come to light because a lot of graves have been unearthed about, um, unfortunately, like people who died at state schools that were intended to assimilate indigenous peoples. And so France has had a hard time really engaging in that conversation. And so even though they purport to be a multicultural citizenship, they have really a very mixed history when it comes to that sort of thing. And and as you might imagine, being a neighbor to America, uh, Canada uh, has not been so culturally alien to a lot of the same pretenses toward manifest destiny that the U.S. Engaged in the 18th and 19th centuries. So that's how national identity might kind of contrast in different places and be have some of the same issues, but kind of look at them from different frames. Uh, then so that's national identity. But taking a look at religion itself, a good example of this is Iran. And pardon me if you come from Iran, I kind of tend to go between saying Iran and Iran. I'm going to try to say Iran. Um, Iran has this supreme leader, and uh, as we mentioned in the last lecture, the supreme leader is we didn't mention Iran, but we mentioned that there is a tendency toward absolute monarchy in some parts of the world, and it really is that, but it's a non-democracy because they have built into their constitution, adopted after the 1979 revolution, a theocracy where the supreme leader is the final uncontested authority. And the supreme leader is appointed by a council of elders, and it's much like the Vatican, much like the Conclave movie that came out recently. So if you want to see how the next supreme leader is going to be chosen in Iran, it's probably a lot like that. Um, but in Iran, they do have elected representatives, but they have to. So you can run for the parliament, and you can run for president, and there are regular elections for president, and those elections are not the freest and fairest in the world, according to Freedom House, but they at least exist. And to be able to run for those offices, you have to be cleared by a council that answers to the supreme leader. So they have pretenses toward democratic elections, but they really are falling under the final authority of the supreme leader in a very clear and specifically laid out way in their constitution. So they have a formally So they embody kind of the fusion of religious and political authority. But then you kind of bump that up against India, that I mentioned in the last lecture, and India formally does have a secular constitution. But in the last 15 years or so, a lot of those secular norms have been eroded. Also, Turkey has a secular constitution adopted in the 1918, somewhere in the 1918 to 1923 period. Um, but they also are seeing a lot of their secular norms undermined by the current party in power, which celebrates a kind of religious national pride. Uh, so that's how national identity. But then that's how religion can be framed and have consequences politically. Then you get to a country like the UK, the United Kingdom, and let me introduce the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And Great Britain, properly understood, is England, Scotland, and Wales. And this all matters. Uh, Scotland is a very small country. It looks like it's big in the movie Braveheart, if you want to go back and watch that, or Outlander, any of that stuff, any of the kind of big hits about Scottish culture. Scotland is really small. Scotland's, I want to say, about 5 million people, and Great Britain is England, Scotland, and Wales, and Wales is probably about the same population as as Scotland. England is like 60 million people, so it's about 16 times as big as Scotland, and Scotland has a distinct linguistic history and cultural history, and so does Wales. Northern Ireland also similarly, but Northern Ireland less so. They have a lot of some Scots, but a lot of English people um, went to go settle in Northern Ireland when it was one country in Ireland, and Northern Ireland was just a region within Ireland. Now, because Southern Ireland kind of declared their independence after the Irish Civil War and was agreed upon by Great Britain, um, these are all kind of cultural outposts that are distinct from English cultural and political history. So I might refer more to England when I talk about, but usually when I'm talking about the UK, we're talking mostly about England. Um, so in England and Britain, very few people apparently say Britain where they live. Working class support for Brexit cut across traditional political party lines and revealed new dimensions of class identity. Class has always been a very present undercurrent, but also explicit current in English and British politics. And it's very simple, actually. Uh, if you are descended from, yeah, if you're descended from an aristocratic family, you belong to a privileged class. Simple as that. Uh, and if you don't, you don't. And you're a common person. And that's the vast majority of the population, uh, which makes for an interesting dialogue that has borrowed a lot of political and cultural conservatism from America, where very few people, well, there's no tradition that claims, um, right to rule based on aristocratic principle. In fact, it's really uh, against American cultural norms to celebrate that sort of thing. Cultural and political social history to celebrate that kind of thing. Not so in England. Um, in England, you talk about the right to rule, you talk about the obligations of the kind of ruling social class, you talk about tradition, you talk about the queen, the king, you talk about celebrating the monarchy as and and keep a stiff upper lip, and pretenses to duty and all of these things. Winston Churchill himself was from an aristocratic family. You might say he was a commoner who was the prime minister of England during World War II. He's kind of the cigar chomping kind of archetype of the political leader. And you should go to the war rooms in London where Churchill conducted the Battle of Britain from. So it's pretty interesting. But the point is that he's the kind of greatest commoner, but there's he was not he was not really. He was an aristocrat. So if you were an aristocrat, there is one political party that you adhere to more than the others, and that is the Tories or the Conservatives, and and Labor was founded in the 19th century and came to power first in the 20th century, and they were the party of the working people and the collective working people. And they had another party, the Liberal Party, that really was originally this tradition of people bringing themselves up through business and the trades and farming, perhaps, and kind of joining the ruling classes, and this kind of ideal of liberal individualism became a very powerful thing in the 19th century, especially. But that really went away. It kind of split into two factions for the most part, of people who were already rulers, and so they joined the Tories, or the people who still felt disadvantaged and underprivileged by the kind of existing economic and political structure. So they joined the Labor Party, or started voting for the Labor Party for the most part. So now you have two parties, but much like the rest of the world, I mean, time marches on, and a lot of these divisions that they thought were meaningful were maybe not as meaningful. And in 2016, there was, a lot of political things happened around the world, but in Great Britain, there was a referendum that no one really thought was going to pass, at least around the world. But it looked like Great Britain cast a deciding vote against staying in the European Union. A majority of voters voted against remaining in the European Union, which is just an earthquake. It just set off. It was damage to the European political consensus that had existed since the end of World War II. It was maybe the most damaging one, is Great Britain leaving the European Union as a body. So they no longer were even going to participate in conversations. They hadn't adopted the currency of the European Union, maybe for fear of Germany and France dominating it. But no one took seriously the idea that Great Britain was going to leave. But they did. It took about 3 years to negotiate it, but they did eventually leave. And so, people really were wondering, this, not just wondering, but they had a really hard time sussing out, well, what class of people actually voted to leave? And, a lot of people, it was older people, it was people who didn't have, who didn't have to worry about like travel or getting jobs in the rest of the European Union, people who had paid off their mortgages already. Certainly there was some nativism there. There was some people who were just anti-immigrant. They didn't like people from Bulgaria particularly, and other parts of Eastern Europe coming into the EU, coming to London, for example, to get jobs. So there was just a lot of different kind of cultural and class strains that were happening in the EU that England was really feeling, and manifested itself in a lot of kind of anti-immigrant sentiment. And finally, there's a couple of case studies that are in your chapter. One is Israel and one is Iran. And Israel has a definition as a, quote, Jewish state, and that complicates citizenship and minority rights. There are a lot of there's at least a population of people that live in Israel proper, uh, that is within the bounds of the internationally recognized borders of Israel, and they speak Arabic and claim Arabic heritage and are practicing Muslims. So that is a that manifests in about, out of 120 seats in parliament, somewhere between 12 and 15 seats in the parliament, the Knesset, typically are awarded to people who are representing Arab majority parties. So they have to take the same allegiance to the Israeli state that the Jewish citizens do. And what about the people who are a-religious or atheists, who happen to live in Israel and would like to exercise their rights in a kind of liberal democracy as well? That complicates things for citizenship and minority rights. Well, Iran has another case study, is that their political legitimacy is rooted in the clerical authority. So in Israel, there is no unified religious authority. There are religious political parties and there's religious traditions, to be sure, and the Jewish state is manifestly religious in nature. But Israel has started to, just the existence of a Jewish state makes the religious national, and it makes it more complicated to say that Israel is a state based on religion, if you are adopting one language, or Hebrew and English as one language, and you claim, and there's any claim at all of kind of ethnic identity in opposition to others. So unless you are explicitly calling for a multicultural democracy that also celebrates one religion over others, then you do get into kind of questions of nationalism, kind of inherently. I think we're starting to see that. So some questions you might want to think of are, can nationalism be inclusive, or is it always exclusionary? And how does class mobility, or lack thereof, class mobility, challenge democratic legitimacy? Those are important questions, I think. Another chapter that we need to cover is chapter 8, and a couple of the concepts that I haven't really introduced to you yet. One is a really important one called mercantilism. So in the political economy chapter, you will find that there are really big streams of thought and vocabulary that get mentioned over and over again. Let me go over what the four are just in rapid succession. So mercantilism, economic liberalism, Marxism, and social democracy. Let me explain what each one of those things are. So one example of mercantilism is India's post-independence economic policy favored domestic industry protection and strategic state intervention. So after their independence was won from Great Britain in the post-war period, they favored really nurturing their infant industries in India and strategic state intervention, subsidies to domestic industries, and tariffs even, to ward off a lot of competition from maybe superior goods, but certainly to ward off competition from just outside trade, and make consumers in India more favorable towards products made in India. And I think that continues to be a struggle in India. So mercantilism, I don't think that's actually a great example of mercantilism based on my notes, but another example of mercantilism is, I think a better example is like Iran. Iran has a lot of oil, right? Like a lot of countries in the Middle East do. But they don't have a lot of oil refineries. And so a lot of companies, a lot of what Iran was upset about was that in the 1950s, what was happening was that BP, British Petroleum was, and I know I've mentioned this in class and lectures before, but um, they had an elected prime minister named Mohammed Mossadegh, and Mossadegh didn't like the state of affairs that was happening because British Petroleum, this British company that also does a lot of business in the United States, uh, owned all of these oil fields that were Iranian, and they were taking the oil and refining it in places like Texas and elsewhere around the world, um, and selling it back to Iran. Uh, and so mercantilism is the idea that you have usually external holdings, and you practice a form of economic nationalism. You are exploiting other countries' resources to their detriment and to the benefit of the mother country. The mother country, in this case, being Great Britain. And Great Britain did a lot of mercantilism, a lot of strategic economic policy that was advantageous to England and not really advantageous to anyone else. Um, and so the problem with the other ideology that I'll explain, um, economic liberalism, also through the lens of the UK, because why not, um, is the idea that free trade can benefit everyone. Well, yes, except that there are countries that start off already doing really well, and those countries that do really well do their best to manipulate the market to make sure that their mother country does better in this kind of free trade system than the developing countries do. And that's even if the developing country is what they're relying on for a lot of the resources or labor to make the products that are then sold anywhere. They could be sold anywhere, um, but they try to make sure that the lion's share of benefit, the cost, is borne by external actors, and the profits go to the mother country as much as possible. So that's mercantilism. Economic liberalism is the idea that privatization is always good. For one thing, you can downsize government, you can do tax cuts, you can break down barriers, you can break down tariff walls, and you can make things like free movement of goods and people around the world your number one public policy priority. Is breaking down barriers between countries to trade, but also breaking down barriers to trade within a country. So deregulation, de you know deregulation, cutting spending, cutting taxes, um, cutting tariffs, and cutting restrictions, and basically it's a synonym for what we would consider just total libertarianism, or just freedom from government, is economic liberalism, promoting trade and economic activity between people and between nations, is what's necessary for the economic world to thrive. One place where you can see economic liberalism at work, or at least in terms of its promotion of economic liberalism, is the magazine The Economist. And if you're curious, if you want to spend $8.95 before you go on a flight sometime at DCA, you can buy a copy of The Economist and hear all of their snarky remarks that they make about the political world on a day-to-day basis. And all of their remarks usually have the intended persuasive effect of making you think that economic liberalism is just common sense. So, they say it's self-evident that someone like Erdogan should be overthrown in Turkey, but when in reality, what they're trying to do is just demonstrate that um, if you take the view that making people more money is good, then really anything that makes people more money is going to be good. Or even the people with money make them more money is good. So their consensus and their energy is around demonstrating why anything else is wrongheaded and not smart. So, so that's social. It's economic liberalism. Marxism. Uh, here's one example of Marxism: is Mao's planned economy and forced equality at the cost of productivity and personal freedom. Um, so, the planned economy in Maoist China, uh, at least in Mao's China, prioritized equality, and so at the cost of productivity and personal freedom. Um, that's no longer the case in China. Like they, at the cost of equality, really, uh, but still the cost of personal freedom. So now productivity is prioritized and has been really since the 80s. But in Mao's China, from the 50s until I guess the 40s, until the 70s when he died, there was at least a large scale social, economic, cultural, and political series of revolutions where Mao is attempting to modernize the economy by making it more universally equal. And that is easier said than done and came with a lot of brutality for sure. But Marxism, that's one example. But Marxism generally is an attempt to establish um, cooperative systems of economy and bringing in a more of a um, self-consciously revolutionary element to thinking and radical element to thinking, and attempting to overthrow the existing economic system by any kind of means. So it really is a lot of strands of thought under Marxism. Um, but the one thing I would say that Marxists can agree on is this attempt to redistribute existing wealth away from the wealthy and towards the unpropertied classes, and make decision making and human need be the watchword of government and any kind of cultural or political or economic system. So that's what Marxism is. I mean, was the Marx quote: "To each according to his ability, to each according to his need." If you want to look up what the ideal of what Marx considered, Marx himself and Lenin as well considered the kind of idealized form of communism, is where it takes its name from, is the Paris Commune period after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 or 1871. I get those years wrong. But at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, Paris kind of barricaded itself against the rest of France and declared itself an autonomous commune. And they got rid of money. For the most part, they didn't really have money, but they abolished rent. They made everybody get the same compensation for work. They had a rotating leadership. They had, so I think they abolished prisons and they did all sorts of things. But it was a very short period of time. It's only about 6 months. And so Lenin wrote a lot about it, but until tens of thousands of people were brutally killed by the French army reinvading and retaking Paris. So it didn't work out in the end. But that's what Marxism is supposed to be, is something like the Paris Commune. Social democracy. Germany has a social market economy, and so does Austria. It blends capitalist production with things like universal health care and worker protections. They have a system where everyone understands that everyone needs health care and everyone needs protections, everyone needs a pension. And so the state facilitates, and if not provides it, then certainly facilitates it within the bounds of financial need and ability. But also they have a lot of essentially capitalist productive consciousness. So I wouldn't call Germany at all anywhere close to something like a Marxist economy. Um, but they have this kind of social safety net economy that is unlike anything that we experience in the United States or in some of the more economically liberal states like Japan or the UK, the United Kingdom, or even Canada. No, Germany and Sweden, particularly, a lot of the northern European states have this social safety net that's really unlike anything else in the rest of the world. Um, but they also have, the reason they have it is because they also have this structure where the two leading political parties lead the economic forces in the country. So the kind of ownership class and business class is represented mostly by the Christian Democrats or conservatives, and have been since the end of the World War II, and the Free Democrats or liberals. And um, they, along with the Social Democrats, which represents labor unions in politics and in government, they have a system where in a corporate structure, the CEO might be a Christian Democrat, and the vice president or the chairman of the board might be a social democrat. So on the way down the line, it gets to be kind of absurd. But what's interesting about it is it forces contact and dialogue between the two leading social and economic strands within politics. So Austria, they do that as well. The country to the immediate south of Germany, it also speaks German. So that's kind of social democracy in action, is social democrats working with conservatives, or liberals working with conservatives, you might say, to kind of foster more dialogue and more of a social consensus. And you have a few case studies in here, and I wanted to just mention them. Germany, as I already mentioned, Germany and China. Germany prioritizes exports in some of their production. They try to sell to the rest of the world. They also emphasize collective bargaining. Like I said, social democrats are always represented in corporate structures, so that you don't see a lot of strikes in Germany, because they take the kind of threat of worker strikes or collective bargaining as a given. While China maintains control over sectors. They have state-run unions, and they have also worker collectives that defy the unions. So China is nothing like Germany, but they both kind of have this influence from Marx at one point. But you can see they've gone in two very different directions as a result. And then talking about the IMF, I'll give you another case study that I want you to take a look at. And one economist that was briefly in power in Greece, named Yanis Varoufakis, he has a very interesting take on what the IMF does. But I'll show you a couple of videos on what the IMF says it does. And they have particularly a long record in the global south. In places like Kenya and Nigeria, some IMF loans reduced public spending and increased austerity, which is just doing everyone's favorite thing, I'm being sarcastic, of increasing spending and cutting benefits. Sorry, increasing taxes and cutting benefits and social welfare programs. And so no one likes that, and no one elects members of parliament to do that sort of thing. But when you take a loan from the IMF to kind of save your country, the International Monetary Fund, that is, it's funded largely by the US, and it's certainly based in the US in Washington, D.C. When they take loans from that body, they agree essentially to, okay, we're going to pay back this loan. And to prove it to you, they sign an agreement, says that they must, before they do anything else, do what the IMF wants. And what the IMF wants is for them to raise government revenue, meaning taxes on its citizens, and cut public spending. It doesn't matter what it's on: education, healthcare, veteran services, whatever. They want to cut it. So that sparked protest in places in the 1980s like Kenya and Nigeria, and certainly in Greece it did back in the 2010s. But really anywhere, the IMF is never popular because they make governments do the unpopular thing. And to hear them tell it, they would call it noble. But those countries largely see it as colonialism and abuse. At least the populations of those countries do. So with that, a couple of questions to leave you with. What counts as a successful economy? Is it growth? Is it being able to pay back your loans? The Greek case is particularly interesting. I hope you take a look at some of those materials. And can developing countries choose their economic models freely under globalization, or are they forced upon them? One more thing. So in terms of research methods, what is the best way to determine lived experiences of inequality in places like Brazil and South Africa? Gini coefficients can show you, how much inequality is there in a country. Like where is social mobility the hardest? And they would tell you Brazil and South Africa are two places where it's very hard. Just the number itself. But what could qualitative methods add? So that's a quantitative method, the Gini coefficient. It looks at, who are the people at the top and who are the people at the bottom, and what's the economic difference between them, and how difficult is it for you to rise up in that ladder. But could qualitative methods add anything to that? Like, could it add to the reasons? I don't know. What could you do to kind of ask people who live in those states, what is it that makes it so difficult, or why do you think the Gini coefficient is this widespread? Anyway, take a look at that, and let me know if you have questions, and also take a look at whatever other materials I add in this particular module. All right, I look forward to your questions.